Okay, this is a good one to look at. So we have, you know, the femur, so your thigh bone, and at the proximal end, that's the end that's closer towards your center of your body, right? So that's the higher, the closer one towards your axial skeleton, towards the spine, is the proximal end, this up here. And the distal end is the one that's at a greater distance from your center, so the further away end. So as the way that the femur is positioned in the pelvis and the acetabulum, so the recepting, so you have the head of the femur as this ball here, and the part that goes, that makes the joint with it, is from the pelvis, and that particular part is called the acetabulum, right? So the head of the femur sits inside the acetabulum, and it can rotate and, you know, rotate around. And so then here, this is the head, obviously, this little round part. And you see this line here, the long axis of head and neck. That's the one I refer to a lot. That's the one I usually talk about when I say rotational axis or hip axis. That's the one I talk about. So this part here is the neck of the femur. And this long part here, this is the shaft of the femur. And then up here, up here, that's the greater trochanter. That's the part that you can feel and that you sit on. I don't know if I can stand up. That's at the side of your pelvis, what you sit on, but you can feel it. That's what sticks out. So it comes out from the center, right? It's sitting in towards the center of the body, and then the neck is at a diagonal out. You can feel this outer part, and then it comes back in. So you see that the femur is not just hanging down, but there's an angle, right? It's at a diagonal. So the long axis of shaft is at an angle to the plumb line, yeah, this is the plumb line, and this is the long axis of the shaft. And my teacher in Axis Syllabus, Frey Faust, he's been teaching a lot about this triangulation of the body. There's a lot of structures that are triangles, yeah, that are triangulated. So that is partially what's also causing these spiraling movements. And we'll see why that is in just a little bit. Okay, so we have all these different angles. And the bottom of the femur here kind of sits on the sort of horizontal plane. You know, this is an imagined line, right? But it's kind of horizontal. So if you place the femur horizontal on the ground or on the tibia, on the plateau of the tibia, it will diagonally go out, and then the neck is going to diagonally reach back towards the body. Yeah. So when you rotate around this axis, can you imagine what kind of path this femur is going to take? So if you just rotate straight around this axis, so if you kind of affix this line here, this long axis of head and neck, if you leave it there and you just let everything rotate around it, can you imagine what the movement looks like in flexion and in extension? That's really hard to imagine, right? I have a leg model. Hold on. This is where this format of Zoom is very challenging, but I'm going to try it anyway because I think it's an important and interesting thing to talk about. Okay, here's a femur. There's a patella kind of stuck to it, but let's see, we have this kind of situation. Actually, we have, this is an anterior view, so we have the other leg. Yeah, it's the opposite leg. But anyway, so the axis, right, this long axis of head and neck, this diagonal one that I call the hip axis or the rotational axis, goes through this femur, right? And it follows the force line, you know, how the forces are transmitted through the structure. So if I imagine this being right in there in the middle and I wanted to rotate this leg around that axis, I don't know if you can see this. I hope you're going to be able to see this. I don't know. So if I rotate, oops, it's hard to do. It's really hard to do. Do you kind of see what's happening? So it's not just going forward and back, but it's actually swinging in this sort of cone-shaped trajectory. Does that make sense? So if you rotate around the axis, the distal end of the femur, the one down here at the near the horizontal plane, this one down here, it's going to come up and follow this line. Yeah? It's not going to follow this line. Does that make sense? So we think of it following this line, and many, many, many dance techniques, when they work in parallel, think of this parallel, the knee facing forward, the knee coming up straight in front of you, straight behind you. But really what wants to happen is it's at a diagonal, and so it swings out at a diagonal. Yeah? So it comes out, it follows this line here, meaning that when the leg comes into flexion in front, I don't know which way I could best show this to you, I have no idea. But when it comes forward into flexion, it actually kind of ends up on your side. Yeah? And when it goes back, it ends up again a little bit towards the side. And that's where I think one of the major differences lie in this way of working as opposed to, let's say, some other modern dance techniques. It's just a different approach to dealing with working with the hip joint, for example, because it doesn't follow the geometry of parallel lines, but of cones and helixes and spirals. Yeah. So that affects the way I work with the hip joint and the way the movements are expressed at the hip. I don't know if that makes any sense. It would be much easier for me to explain this in a room with you. I'm gonna, let's see. Let's try. So obviously, everybody basically shares this situation, right? Everybody has the head, the shaft, the greater trochanter, you know, all those things, the neck, right? But there's slight differences. Everybody's a little bit different, right? The shape might be a little bit different. The thing that here's the other half, right? Here's the pelvis. So when this inserts into this acetabulum right there, this is the side view, yeah? You can see this from the side, it's the right side outside. This is the right leg. So it fits in there like that. So, you know, if the shape of this is a little different or the shape of this is a little different, we have different situations, right? If the orientation of the surface, the receptive surface, is more forward, we have knees that point further in. If it's orienting further out, we have knees that face further out. If it's a deeper socket, we have less range of motion. If it's a shallower socket, we have a lot of range of motion, for example. And also, you see that the angle at the neck here, this long axis that I was talking about, could be different because the angle at the neck could be different. So the average is this 126 degree, which I think this is a pretty average femur, sort of, that's probably about 126 degrees. But then of course it could be much shallower or much steeper. And it would actually really affect how much of a cone-shaped trajectory your leg would have. Does that make sense? So I have this model. So I don't know. Maybe let me go out sharing screen for a second, and see if it'll be better. Maybe you can go and see if you can see my picture bigger somehow. But so if this angle, all right, do you see the idea here? Yeah, with the head and the neck and the shaft. So if this angle is really steep, let's say 90 degrees, and I rotate around this hip axis, it's going to go straight forward and back at a 90 degrees. If it's more angled, it'll come out. Does that make sense? It'll go into this, yeah? That's the situation at our hip. But of course, it then can be more, right? And so the more of an angle like this you have, the more the leg's going to want to go out to the side into abduction, right? Does that make sense? So, questions?
So do you mean that there are two major variations? One is how deep that shaft, how deep that hole is?
Yes, yeah. That has something to do with. So if we talk about range of motion at the hip, right? Because in dance, that's always an issue. We want lots of range of motion and lots of turnout and beautiful lines and big penchés. But not everybody can do it. And, you know, there's lots of reasons why it might be different for people. You know, ligaments might be tighter, muscles might be tighter, but also the bones might be just kind of shaped in a way where the situation is simply different. So yeah, if this socket, let's say, yeah, it's kind of a ball and socket in a sense. If this socket is very deep and like sort of holds, you know, hugs this ball a lot, then you have less range. If it's more shallow, like the shoulder, then you have more range, right? Does that make sense?
Right.
And the shoulder joint is really, really shallow. Here's a shoulder. It also has a neck, and you can hardly see it. It's like a bulldog, it has a, you know, little tiny neck, but it does have a neck, and there is an angle, and it has this head. And the acetabulum, which is not called acetabulum, but the glenoid fossa, is very, very shallow, right? It's hardly hugging this bone at all. It's just kind of snuggling up a little, right? So there's a lot more range of motion possible at the shoulder. I mean, if you look at it, the shoulder is extremely flexible, right? So if you had a shallower acetabulum, you would have, you know, definitely, if everything else is working with that too, ligaments, etc., you would theoretically have a greater range of motion.
I see.
There can also be, you know, changes in bone shape. Like if you have more of a protrusion here, then you have less abduction. You can't lift the leg out as far. You also have to always imagine there's soft tissues, lots of soft tissues around all this stuff too. So it's not just all this range of motion. We have less because there's bursa and ligaments and muscle and fatty tissues and nerves and all those kinds of things, right? But generally speaking, if there was more of a bony protrusion, then you could not come up so high, right? So it depends on the shape. It also depends on orientation. So we have two halves. I only have one here, but if you just imagine another thing, right, like this. This is the pubic symphysis right in the front, in the middle. And then so the spine is back here, right? So this angle is different in individuals, you know, not everybody's femurs, you know, the acetabulum points, you know, 45 degree to the side. One might be 43 or 40 or whatever it is, or further out, right? Some people, when they have a lot of external rotation, often they struggle with internal rotation. And if people have a lot of internal rotation, often they struggle with not being able to go external. That's my version. I have a lot of internal and not so much external, right? So the shape of this will affect the degree of external rotation, or generally range of motion and the path of motion, right? Now, other factors are also, if you can see, this bone is not straight, right? It's bowed like this. So it's bowed backwards, right, towards the back of the leg. And it's also got a torsion. So I think I have an image. Let me share the screen again. I think I have an image for that showing. Okay, this is the same thing, but maybe a bit clearer. So as the condyles are laying on the ground, they're laying along the coronal plane, along the frontal plane, right? And so the neck here, the head and the neck, and this axis I was talking about, this rotational axis here, is not parallel to that. It's not flat, it's rotated. So the angle of anteversion here is 30 degrees. So there's a rotation, there's a torsion of 30 degrees, right? So if this neck of the femur and head were really on the frontal plane, the knees are facing in. They're not facing forward. Does that make sense? And that's another thing in dance. Very often we so strive towards having the knees, the patella face forward in parallel first position. So it's like knees face forward. But if you just let it hang there, you actually end up with a slight inward rotation and the knees facing in. On most people, on a lot of people. Let's put it that way. On people like me, a lot of inward rotation, and on some others, maybe none, because they have a lot of external rotation. Does this make any sense? Almost, yeah? Maybe. Okay. See if I can find other images that make this more clear. This top image here, left side of pelvis, it says, is this view of the pelvis like I showed you here, right? From the side. So same orientation, person is oriented the same way, but you can see that the acetabulum here is pointing down for more and more anterior, more forward and down. This one is more out and to the side, more up and side. Does that make sense? Yeah? You also see the angle here of the ramus. It's different, also shallower and higher. On this one, shallower, and on this one, higher. Yeah. So like the title says, illustrates skeletal variation. Femurs. This is, just put you guys to the side. Down here, a row of feet, right? Laying next to one another. So every time the condyles here at the distal end are laying flat on the ground, right? So that's always the same. And you can see the degree of rotation here, very flat, almost parallel, raised a little bit, raised a little more, a little more, a little more, and raised the most. Does that make sense? So almost 45 degrees difference between this person and this person. Yeah, just in the amount of torsion in the femur. Like this part of the bone being, you know, spiraling. It's a spiraling bone. Yeah? So there's already a spiral in the femur, in the shaft of the femur. You can't see it so.
So does it mean that the more the rotation, the more backwards the knee will face if we stand straight facing forward? Right.
I'm not quite sure if I understand that. Let's see. This image might show it. It's the same bones as on the left here, I believe, yeah? This one is the same as this one. Yes, so the two condyles you can see are flat on the ground in every bone, right? Flat on the ground here. So it's all the same starting point, and the torsion in this part of the femur is different. So this one is almost 90 degrees, and this last one is almost 45 less. Yeah? So this person, if we have this leg and put it into this acetabulum here, which is pointing kind of sideways, yeah? This guy's, or this woman's knees would almost point straight forward. Whereas if I insert this acetabulum, this head into the acetabulum, this person's knees would face inward. Does that make sense? Because the pelvis would be aligned this way. So on this person, the pelvis is more like this, is meeting the head like this. And on this person, it's meeting it more like this. Does that make any sense? Is it getting any better? Again, here are the two extremes, yeah? Almost 90 degree torsion, and here more a 45 degree torsion. Yeah? So if this angle here, this rotational axis that goes through the neck and the head, inserts into the acetabulum will be here. And so generally speaking, the pelvis is oriented this way. Yeah? Here, the rotational axis runs this way, 45 degrees. And the acetabulum is here. So generally speaking, the pelvis is oriented this way. So if you imagine this pelvis being here, then the knee down at the bottom is facing in. Yeah? If you imagine the pelvis here, the knee down here is facing much more forward. So these two lines of the pelvis orientation and the knee patella trajectory are hitting each other much later than here. Yeah, they're meeting already here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Rather than this. So, I mean, it takes time, yeah, to sort of look at these things and then move with it a little bit to really grasp this. But what I want to get out of it for now is that there's a lot of complexity. There's not just one thing that affects the range of motion. Yeah. So here's the femur. Right. This rotational axis. Yeah. It's very hard to do. So describing a cone coming forward and out. Forward and out, and in and out. It's very hard to see, isn't it? Very hard to see. Let's see if we can maybe just together get up and sense the hip joint. Maybe we can just play with it a little bit, let it swing around in there. So I'm going away from midline. I'm not here, parallel. I'm going away from midline. Yeah? And then coming down, slight internal rotation, extension, abduction, and as I go back, keeps rotating in and comes out a little bit. So it doesn't stay totally behind, it goes a little bit out to the side. This is very awkward for anybody who's like dance trained. So bear with me. Yeah? So just let the legs swing a little bit. Let it kind of to the side describe sort of a cone-shaped trajectory to the side. So try not to make it stay somewhere in a straight line. Just let it swing. If you take the opportunity and you go with the rotation and the flexion, it could take you into a little bit of a turn. Tiny bit of a turn. Tiny bit of a turn. I think we talked about this. When you walk, if you're just walking, just observe what your hip is doing. And if you stop, then a step forward. Yeah, that's what we strive for in a lot of yoga classes and a lot of dance technique classes, but really, let's not go in that direction right now. Yeah? Allow the pelvis to swing with, and so the front leg will be slightly externally rotated, and the back leg is slightly internally rotated. Now the knees are probably, the feet are probably more or less facing forward. Yeah? So what you have really is the front leg is showing you the expression of the hip axis arc on the flexion side, on the front. Yes? Abducted, rotated out, and going out to the side. The back hip is showing you the extension phase, which is an internal rotation and an abduction. That's really hard to explain over Zoom. That's crazy. So if you let it swing a little more, make a little figure 8, to exaggerate it a little bit. You know, open in the front and closing in the back. Yeah, and you allow your bottom foot to change. Yeah, you allow it to do whatever it wants to do. I'm not binding it, not rooting it down. So go small, go like a tiny movement. It's almost like it's making a little circle in the back. Yeah. Shoom, pop, pop, shoom. Let me see how that's going. So if you lay down on the ground with your knees a little bit bent, just explore the range of motion of your leg, internal and external rotation. So you're just kind of bringing it up and down, just kind of seeing how far it'll fall open. Generally speaking, people experience that there's more of an opening the higher you come towards your head, right? And less of an ability to rotate externally the further down you go. So when the leg is almost stretched out to the ground, there's much less external rotation. For me, more so because I don't have a lot of external rotation. So the path is such that the leg comes with the knee straight up, and then it goes out. Right? Instead of turning out and forcing it out right away. Yeah? That's the path chosen in ballet, is rotate out and go out. And it very much forces a path along the outer edge, yeah, the edges of range of motion. I want to find the ideal path, that's the one in the middle. So I follow towards the center of the leg, the center of the body, and then out. So it's a curved path. Let's do the other side a little bit. Just gonna play with the rotation. Nice little side effect would be that your core is working right? Doing a little bit of ab work. Not too much, it shouldn't be tense, right? So just playing around with leg swinging. Thinking about the relationship of the head and the neck of the femur and the acetabulum. Can you try to start laying on your back? Legs maybe stretch out. And then take your left leg to come up in this manner that we've described. So the knee comes straight up and then starts to go out. As that happens, you start to rotate a little bit your body. And the leg crosses over. Pulls your weight with it. Now pulls you into a nice stretch and a nice spiral. Just before the foot touches down the ground, you bring it back and it reaches behind you. And then your right leg is up. It comes across, reaches across. Nice long spiral. Just before it touches down, it comes back. And you have the opposite situation. Yeah? Here. And then you come down. And then you have the left knee up. And the foot comes across. Reaches. You have a nice long stretch, of like an X. Yeah? Before the foot touches down, it comes back. It reaches behind you and the arm reaches in front of you. And then you change onto your back. You have the right knee up. And the right leg reaches across. Nice stretch. Before it touches down, it comes back and you have the opposite. The right arm reaches forward and the right leg reaches back. And you come onto the back. Left knee up. Reaching across. This X